They keep insisting the truce signals the end of the oil panic. They claim tankers will sail freely again. They promise prices will cool off. Yet, when I traced 5 essential corridors, 4 emergency reserve deployments, 2 major detour pipelines, and freight fees that exploded into million-dollar escape payments, a very different reality emerged. Economists are whispering concerns few are discussing. On May 1st, 2026, the United Arab Emirates formally stepped away from OPEC discipline. On May 5th, Ukraine struck one of Russia's largest refining hubs. By the first week of May, companies were already spending millions rather than thousands to avoid the routes the world once relied on. The true narrative is not about a ceasefire holding. The real story is that the global system has already begun rerouting for the next disruption. Today, I will walk through the figures and hard evidence showing why this oil shock may outlive the fighting. Who benefits from the new pathways? Which nations remain locked into outdated ones? Why did one shortcut suddenly gain a $1 million price tag? And how does every shift ripple toward your fuel bill, groceries, mortgage, and even the ballot box? Many assume the crisis ends once gunfire fades. Reality says otherwise. On April 8th, 2026, news circulated about a ceasefire between the United States and Iran. Markets reacted instantly. Brent crude retreated from its peaks. Commentators breathed out. Yet by May 7th, what existed was not a peace agreement, but a temporary memorandum of understanding, granting a 30-day negotiation window. Vessel seizures and naval standoffs continued even after the truce announcement. The scale of damage runs deep. The International Energy Agency reported exports moving through Hormuz dropped to under 10% of pre-conflict flow. 10%. That collapse forced the largest coordinated strategic stock release in the agency's history. On March 11th, members agreed to make 400 million barrels available. By March 19th, the official breakdown showed a combined pledge of 426 million barrels, 172.2 million from the United States, 79.8 million from Japan, 22.5 million from South Korea, 19.5 million from Germany, 14.6 million from France, and 14 million from the United Kingdom. The U.S. Department of Energy launched its first exchange tranche of 86 million barrels on March 13th. These barrels were not released because everything felt secure. They were deployed because the safety buffer was evaporating. IEA Chief Fatih Birol stated plainly that the move eased pain without fixing the core issue. Data backs him up. The agency's April report showed global supply shrinking by 10.1 million barrels per day in March. On May 4th, as tensions climbed, Brent crude reached $110.44, while WTI climbed to $106.40. After conflicting ceasefire headlines, Brent swung between roughly $96 and above $102 by May 7th. Headline relief appeared, but normalization never arrived. Prices remain about 40% higher than before the crisis. On May 4th, the Chevron CEO warned publicly that real shortages would surface once reserves and commercial surpluses were absorbed. By May 6th, Reuters reported executives and analysts expecting tighter supply in the coming weeks, even if the conflict ended. Restarting Middle East cargoes takes weeks. Rebuilding inventories requires months. All of this collides with peak summer demand from driving, aviation, agriculture, and freight. This is what most overlook. A ceasefire may halt fighting, yet it cannot refill drained strategic reserves. It cannot reverse the barrels burned during March and April. It cannot shorten voyages from the Persian Gulf to Rotterdam or Yokohama, and it cannot erase the new risk premium insurers, shippers, and refiners now embed into every operation after learning the same lesson. Hormuz can become a weapon. Insurance stays costly. Routes remain longer. Inventory targets rise. Costs persist long after diplomats sign documents. Pull back and view the map. Before February 2026, the system depended on a single assumption. The Strait of Hormuz would always stay open. About 20 million barrels per day passed through. Tankers sailed without war risk coverage. Routes were optimized for efficiency. That assumption collapsed. Now the critical question is no longer who holds the most oil, but who controls the best escape path. Saudi Arabia stands out as the clearest winner. When Hormuz closed, the kingdom pushed its east-west pipeline, the Petroline, to full capacity of about 7 million barrels per day. By late March, crude flowed across the peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, bypassing the strait entirely. Roughly 2 million barrels per day supply Western Saudi refineries, leaving around 5 million barrels per day available for export. Reuters reported Yanbu shipments nearing 4.6 to 5 million barrels per day in late March, effectively reaching export capacity. Aramco CEO Amin Nasser confirmed in May that the line hit maximum throughput and had become a critical supply artery. Financial results told the same story. Aramco's first quarter 2026 net profit jumped 25% year over year to $32.5 billion on revenue of $115.49 billion. This is not a company suffering a crisis. It is a company monetizing one because the infrastructure already existed. Then comes the United Arab Emirates. On April 28th, the country declared it would exit both OPEC and OPEC Plus effective May 1st. Officials cited sovereignty over production strategy and the aim to supply the market without restrictions. Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazrouei said the nation owed that freedom to investors. Beneath the language lies a larger calculation. ADNUC has committed $150 billion to expand output capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027. Under OPEC quotas, production sat near 3.5 million. The numbers simply did not add up. Reuters reported that officials in the United Arab Emirates view 5 million barrels per day as the immediate production objective and have signaled that output could climb to 6 million if market demand calls for it. Yet this story stretches beyond raw production numbers. The country operates its own bypass pipeline extending 249 miles toward the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, positioned outside the Strait of Hormuz. During the conflict, the UAE strengthened strategic ties with the United States and Israel, and at the same moment it chose to step away from OPEC's shared production discipline when that discipline was weakest. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are moving along separate paths. Saudi Arabia is pushing maximum volumes through its alternative corridor. Meanwhile, the UAE is abandoning the cartel structure altogether to secure full production flexibility. Still, both send the same signal. The old Gulf arrangement in which the United States ensured security while Gulf producers guaranteed steady supply through coordinated quotas is beginning to fracture. These nations found themselves confronting the crisis largely alone. Now the question is how this reshapes the dollar system and the trust framework connecting Washington with Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. When the traditional corridor becomes risky, the nation with a back door suddenly gains leverage. Follow the cargo flows. If Hormuz is blocked, ships reroute, and rerouting introduces new choke points. Trade geography follows a simple rule. When one bottleneck collapses, the economic rent shifts elsewhere. Evidence from April and May 2026 points directly to the Panama Canal. According to the Panama Canal Authority, the first half of fiscal year 2026 saw 6288 transits, an increase of 224 year over year. Daily averages reached 34 vessels in January and climbed to 37 in March, with peak days surpassing 40. Total tonnage hit 254 million PCU tons, roughly 5% higher than the previous year. Pricing, however, tells the deeper story. Chief Financial Officer Victor Weil explained that auction premiums, the extra amount companies pay beyond the standard transit fee for priority passage, averaged between $13,500 and $14,000 before the Middle East conflict. After the Hormuz shutdown between March and April, the figure surged to around $385,000. Some vessels paid above $100,000 in auction premiums, and at least one company reportedly spent $4,000 for a single slot to urgently move fuel from Europe to Singapore, where shortages were forming. That $4,000 payment was not the regular toll. It represented a one-time auction premium to jump the queue for a reserved slot. Canal authorities described it as a temporary market phenomenon rather than an official price. Yet the willingness to pay such a sum reveals the extraordinary state of global shipping in the spring of 2026. What ships drove this demand? Canal officials said energy cargo became increasingly dominant. Reuters connected the surge to rising LNG and LPG traffic and to alternative oil and commodity shipments, departing the U.S. Gulf Coast toward Asia. Oil deliveries to China, Japan, and South Korea through Panama reportedly doubled. This is what a reshaped trade system looks like in practice. A conflict in the Persian Gulf made a canal in Central America 3 times more expensive. A disruption 8,000 miles away repriced transit capacity in a completely different ocean. Every added dollar then cascades into freight costs, fuel prices, commodity markets, and eventually consumer expenses. The beneficiary of a crisis is not always an ally or an adversary. Sometimes it is simply the owner of the alternate route. When one choke point fails, another becomes invaluable. Many speak of Iran's nuclear program as the ultimate deterrent. Yet in 2026, Iran reminded the world it already possesses a force capable of moving markets instantly. Geography. Here is the baseline. The International Energy Agency estimates that about 20 million barrels per day of crude and oil products passed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025, representing roughly 25% of global seaborne oil trade. Qatar and the UAE together account for nearly 20% of global LNG exports dependent on this passage. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reports that around 20% of worldwide LNG trade moved through Hormuz in 2024, with 83% of those volumes heading toward Asia. Alternative routes remain limited. The IEA estimates only 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of alternate crude routing capacity exists outside the strait. In short, most flows cannot be replaced quickly. Consider the exposure. Japan imports approximately 95% of its crude through Hormuz. South Korea relies on it for about 70%. India depends on it for roughly 50%. China receives around 5.4 million barrels per day via the strait. Reuters adds that Asia overall sources nearly 60% of its crude from the Middle East. The impact arrives fast. On April 20th, Reuters reported only 3 vessels crossing Hormuz within 12 hours, compared with a normal flow of about 130 vessels daily. Brent crude rose roughly 5% that single day. War risk insurance rates climbed from about 2% to near 3% of ship value. Separate reporting on April 7th indicated some war risk premiums surged as much as 1,000%, prompting India to consider a $15,000 sovereign guarantee fund, along with a $3,000 industry pool to support marine insurance. What Iran demonstrated has been carefully framed by analysts and intelligence officials. Reuters reported Gulf concerns that negotiations could cement Tehran's golden grip on Hormuz. Iranian sources called the strait a golden geographic asset and a deterrence tool. A Reuters intelligence story on April 3rd said U.S. assessments believed Iran was unlikely to loosen its hold because control over the world's most critical oil artery remained its primary leverage. International Crisis Group expert Ali Vaez offered a striking summary suggesting the United States may have handed Iran a weapon of mass disruption. This was expert analysis, not literal equivalence. Still, the logic resonates. Nuclear weapons represent a future threat. Hormuz operates as a lever today, influencing prices, freight, insurance, supply chains, inflation, elections, and public sentiment in real time. Iran did not need to launch a nuclear strike. It only had to threaten the route the world depends on. The oil shock does not remain confined to the Gulf. Its effects spread outward in widening circles. Begin with Russia. At first glance, higher prices and turmoil in the Middle East might appear beneficial for Moscow. But events unfolded differently. On May 5th, Reuters reported that the Karishi refinery, the second largest in Russia, stopped processing after Ukrainian drone strikes damaged 3 out of 4 crude distillation units. The facility handles about 20 million metric tons each year, close to 400,000 barrels per day, equal to roughly 7% of Russian refining capacity. This incident was not isolated. During April, Reuters indicated Russian oil production may have dropped between 300,000 and 4,000 barrels per day compared with first quarter levels, marking the steepest monthly decline in 6 years after repeated attacks targeting ports, refineries, and pipeline routes. In that same month, disruptions or shutdowns were reported at Sizin, Novo-Quebec, Tuapse, Norcy, the Sarat refinery, and facilities linked to Primorsk and Novorossiysk. Exports did continue, with about 2.2 million barrels per day shipped from major Western ports in April. Yet the simplistic claim that Russia could effortlessly replace missing Gulf supply collapses under scrutiny. Filling a Gulf-sized gap becomes impossible when domestic refining capacity is steadily degraded across the Atlantic. On May 8th, Descartes reported that April U.S. containerized imports totaled 2,279,65 TEUs, declining 3.2% from March and falling 5.5% compared with April 2025. Imports originating from China dropped 4.3% month over month and plunged 15.3% year over year. The Port of Long Beach said first quarter 2026 volumes decreased 5.7%, compared with the record pace of 2025. Gene Soroka, executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, warned that tariff uncertainty and the Middle East conflict, especially fuel costs, were weighing heavily on consumers and businesses. U.S. manufacturing data showed supplier delivery times worsening, while input prices climbed to a 4-year high as Hormuz disruptions pushed raw material and freight costs upward. The supply chain is not collapsing dramatically. Instead, it is slowly wearing down. Costs rise quietly, timelines stretch, profit margins narrow. Importers begin front-loading shipments through West Coast ports to hedge against additional disruption, and this defensive behavior itself distorts normal trade patterns. Now cross the Atlantic again toward Europe. On May 7th, the United Kingdom held local elections that delivered dramatic results. Reform UK gained 1,151 English council seats. Labour lost 115. The Conservatives dropped 466. In Wales, Plaid Cymru secured the largest number of seats in the Senedd. In Scotland, the Scottish National Party maintained a clear lead. The Green Party captured the Hackney mayoralty from Labour. Prime Minister Starmer connected the cost of living crisis directly to conflicts in Ukraine and Iran. Financial markets reacted calmly. Sterling strengthened and UK borrowing costs declined after Starmer signaled policy continuity. There was no panic. Still, the political message was unmistakable. Fragmentation is widening under the pressure of inflation and public anger over living costs. Across the euro area, Eurostat's April flash estimate showed inflation rising to 3% from 2.6% in March, while energy inflation jumped to 10.9% from 5.1%. This was not a statistical anomaly. It was the Hormuz premium appearing inside European consumer prices. The transmission chain is direct and relentless. Oil shocks raise energy costs. Higher energy costs push up food, transportation, and manufacturing expenses. Rising expenses erode household purchasing power. Reduced purchasing power transforms into voter frustration. And voter frustration does not target Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the Panama Canal Authority. It targets the government directly in front of voters. This is where the story reaches you. Grocery receipts will never list Panama Canal auction fees. Electricity bills will never mention Hormuz war risk premiums. Gas station price tags will not display east-west pipeline rerouting surcharges. Yet the impact is embedded everywhere. When a tanker that once crossed the Strait of Hormuz in 3 days now spends 3 weeks sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, every barrel becomes more expensive. When a container ship pays $35,000 instead of $5,000 to transit Panama, those extra costs appear inside the goods within the containers. When war risk insurance rises by 1,000% on Gulf routes, refiners pay more for crude, and consumers pay more for gasoline, diesel, heating oil, jet fuel, fertilizer, and every product that relies on them. The International Energy Agency committed 426 million barrels from emergency reserves to prevent the system from freezing. The United States alone released over 100 million barrels from its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which had already been reduced by earlier drawdowns. These releases soften the shock but cannot be quickly replenished. The buffer existed, and the buffer has been spent. Summer approaches, driving season, aviation demand, agricultural diesel consumption, freight volumes. All of these forces push demand upward exactly when supply remains constrained and reserves are depleted. Even if a ceasefire holds and evolves into something durable, the structural damage has already occurred. Companies have recalibrated risk models. Insurers have reset premiums. Shipping companies have rerouted fleets. Governments have drained strategic stockpiles. The UAE has already left OPEC. Saudi Arabia has proven it can bypass the Gulf and export near maximum capacity through the Red Sea. Iran has demonstrated that a 21-mile-wide strait can function as a weapon of economic mass disruption. None of this reverses with a handshake. What we are witnessing is not a temporary surge. It is a lasting increase in the cost of moving energy and goods across the planet. Call it the geography tax. Call it the choke point premium. Call it the price of realizing that trusted routes were never as secure as assumed. The world is not returning to the old normal. Instead, globalization is reappearing in a more expensive form. Bypass pipelines now matter more than alliances. Auction premiums replace negotiated tariffs. Strategic reserves become political currency. Control of a narrow waterway gives a mid-sized nation leverage over the global economy. The ceasefire may silence weapons, but the trade map has already shifted and the bill has already arrived. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.